November 17, 1943, 23:47 hours RAF Ridgewell, Essex, England. Sergeant Daniel Danny Kovacs sat alone in the radio room beneath the control tower, headphones pressed against his ears, listening to nothing but atmospheric static. Outside, fog had rolled in from the North Sea 2 hours earlier, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. The runway lights were invisible. The world had become an undifferentiated void. Somewhere in that void, 23 bombers were trying to find their way home. The mission had launched at 6:15 hours, a daylight raid against Bremen. 23 B-17s from the 381st Bomb Group, part of a larger formation attacking targets across northern Germany. The weather forecast had called for clear skies. The forecast had been catastrophically wrong. Radio communication had been intermittent since 1700 hours. The weather was creating electrical interference that swamped normal frequencies. Every transmission was buried under layers of static and crackling noise. At 2100 hours, the first bomber had made it back, Memphis Belle II, guided by desperate dead reckoning and pure luck. The pilot had found the field by following the river valley, landing with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. 3 more bombers had followed over the next hour, but 19 aircraft were still out there, and fuel was running out. Kovacs checked the mission clock. The formation had been airborne for 17 hours and 32 minutes. B-17s carried enough fuel for roughly 18 hours at cruise speed. The remaining bombers had less than 30 minutes before engines started failing. The problem wasn't equipment. RAF Ridgewell had standard radio direction-finding gear and homing beacons, but all of that depended on clear frequencies and pilots who could receive signals through the interference. And right now, atmospheric interference was winning. Kovacs tried transmitting on the emergency frequency. Any 381st aircraft, this is Ridgewell Tower. Acknowledge. Static, nothing but static. He pulled off his headphones and rubbed his eyes. 19 hours on duty, watching the operations board fill with red markers indicating aircraft that hadn't returned. Major William Sutherland entered the radio room carrying a clipboard. Anything. Nothing intelligible, sir. The interference is blocking everything. Can we boost transmission power? We're already at maximum. The problem isn't strength. It's that atmospheric conditions are creating so much noise that our signal gets lost. Sutherland set down his clipboard. 19 aircraft out there, probably less than 20 minutes of fuel. If we don't get them down, we're going to lose cruise. Kovacs stared at his equipment. Standard procedure was to transmit clear voice messages, but clear voice required clear frequencies. What they had was static. Static interference, noise. Then something clicked, a memory from training, an instructor explaining that receivers detected patterns, not just signals. Even in noisy environments, a receiver could identify a repeating pattern if it was distinct enough. Sir, what if we don't try to cut through the static? Kovacs said slowly. What if we use it? What do you mean? Create a pattern. Pulse bursts of carrier wave in a specific rhythm. The static will still be there, but our signal will create a pattern inside it, like Morse code but using static instead of tones. Sutherland stared at him. That's not standard procedure. No, sir, but standard procedure isn't working. And pilots will hear this pattern. The human brain is good at finding patterns in chaos. We make the pulses long enough, repeat them regularly, and pilots' radios will pick up the rhythm even if they can't hear voice. Sutherland made his decision in 3 seconds. Do it. You've got 15 minutes. Kovacs sat down and started adjusting settings. He switched to carrier wave-only transmission, bypassing modulation circuits. Then he rigged a manual interrupt, literally a switch he could flip on and off to pulse the signal. At 23:51 hours, Kovacs began transmitting. 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off, 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off, 3 seconds on, 5 seconds off, repeat. The signal strength meter flickered with each pulse, and somewhere in the fog over eastern England, 19 bomber crews were hearing something they'd never heard before, a pattern emerging from chaos, a rhythm cutting through static, a beacon that might be the only thing that could guide them home. Captain Robert Dutch Holland, flying Hell's Kitchen, had been circling at 8,000 feet for 40 minutes, burning fuel he didn't have. His navigator was dead, killed by flak over Bremen. His radio operator had a head wound and was unconscious. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Chen, stared at instruments that were starting to blur. "We're down to 20 minutes of fuel," Chen said quietly. Holland knew. Land in 15 minutes or ditch in the North Sea. Those were the options. And ditching a B-17 at night in winter water was a death sentence. His radio crackled with static. It had been crackling for hours, endless white noise and interference. Then something changed. Inside the static, Holland heard a rhythm. 3 pulses of louder static. Pause, 3 more pulses, longer pause, repeat. "You hearing that?" he asked Chen. Chen tilted his head. "Sounds like interference patterns." "No, too regular. Someone's transmitting that." Holland checked his frequency. 121, 5 megahertz, the emergency band. The pattern was coming through clear. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, long pause, repeat. "It's a beacon," Holland said. "Someone's pulsing a carrier wave." "How do we home on static?" "Same way we'd home on any signal. Turn toward it, watch signal strength, follow it to the source." Holland banked left, adjusting heading while watching the signal strength indicator. The pattern got louder, not clearer but more pronounced. "Signal's getting stronger on heading 270, Chen said. Holland steadied on that heading and descended to 5,000 feet. The fog was still thick, visibility maybe a quarter mile, but better than zero at altitude. The pattern continued. 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, pause, regular as a heartbeat. They flew for 8 minutes. The fuel gauges were deep into red. The number 3 engine was starting to cough, fuel starvation. At 23:59 hours, they broke through fog and saw lights dim, barely visible. Runway lights, RAF Ridgewell. "I see the field," Chen shouted. Holland had maybe 3 minutes of fuel left. He dropped flaps, cut power, descended in a steep glide that would have horrified any instructor. Hell's Kitchen touched down at 1 hours, main gear hitting hard, rolling to a stop with less than 2 minutes of fuel in the tanks. When the engines shut down, Holland sat motionless, hands shaking. Realizing he'd just navigated blind through fog using nothing but a pattern of static he didn't understand but had trusted completely. Over the next 30 minutes, 11 more bombers found their way home using the same pattern. Pilots who had been circling aimlessly suddenly heard rhythm in the static and followed it. Not all made it. 3 aircraft ran out of fuel before reaching the field. 1 crew belayed out and survived. 2 ditched in the North Sea. 1 crew was rescued. The other was never recovered. But 12 aircraft that would have been lost came home because a radio operator had improvised a navigation aid that existed nowhere in any manual and worked precisely, because it didn't fight the interference. It used it. In the radio room, Kovacs kept pulsing his beacon until the last bomber landed at 34 hours. Then he shut down the transmitter and stared at the equipment. Major Sutherland entered. 12 aircraft recovered that would have been lost, approximately 120 crew members alive. He paused. "What you did tonight saved lives." "I'm not sure it's repeatable, sir." "Then we need to figure out how to make it repeatable, because we're going to have more nights like this." Sutherland picked up the logbook. "Write down everything. The frequency, the pulse timing, the switch setup, everything. Tomorrow you're briefing the group commander." Kovacs nodded. He'd spent 6 hours watching a mission clock count down toward disaster, then 15 minutes improvising a solution that barely made sense. And somehow, it had worked. Outside, ground crews were counting returning bombers and updating the status board with numbers that should have been much worse. 12 recovered, 3 lost, 8 still missing. The odds were better than they should have been. And the reason was a sergeant with a radio transmitter who had decided that when clear signals failed, unclear signals, carefully structured, deliberately patterned, might be good enough. The briefing took place at 900 hours on November 18 in the group commander's office. Colonel Harrison Reed sat behind his desk, flanked by Major Sutherland and Captain Leonard Walsh, the signals officer. Sergeant Kovacs stood at attention, sleep-deprived, still wearing the same uniform from 26 hours earlier. Reed spoke first. "Sergeant, explain how your procedure worked." Kovacs explained. The atmospheric interference, the failure of standard communications, the decision to pulse carrier wave transmissions in a pattern pilots could detect through static, the 3-pulse rhythm that became an ad hoc homing beacon. When he finished, Reed looked at Walsh. "Captain, is this technically viable?" Walsh had been taking notes. "Yes, sir." He essentially created a non-voice beacon using amplitude pulsing. It's crude, but under those conditions, it would be more detectable than voice transmissions because pattern recognition doesn't require clear signal decoding. Can we standardize it? With modifications, yes. We'd need to establish specific patterns for different airfields, create documentation, and probably build dedicated equipment instead of manually pulsing. Reed turned back to Kovacs. "Sergeant, you violated radio procedures by transmitting non-standard signals without authorization. Under normal circumstances, that would be grounds for disciplinary action." Kovacs said nothing. "However," Reed continued, 12 aircraft recovered, approximately 120 lives saved. Those outcomes matter more than procedural violations, but what you did needs to become official procedure. That requires documentation, testing, and approval from 8th Air Force Headquarters. How long will that take, sir? Weeks, possibly months. And if we have another night like last night before then? Reed's jaw tightened. Then we'll lose crews waiting for authorization to do something we already know works. Sutherland spoke up. "Sir, we could implement this informally. Brief pilots on what to listen for. Have trained operators ready to pulse when weather warrants it. Not official doctrine, but not prohibited either." "A tactical adaptation that circumvents protocol," Reed said flatly. "Yes, sir." Reed was silent. Then, "Captain Walsh, document this procedure and submit it for official review. That's by the book. Major Sutherland, brief squadron commanders so pilots know what to listen for. That's practical. We do both and see which moves faster, authorization or necessity." "And if headquarters prohibits it?" Walsh asked. "Then we'll discuss whether following orders that kill crews is more important than improvising solutions that bring them home." Reed stood. Dismissed. Over 2 weeks, Kovacs's beacon became an open secret. Pilots were briefed on the 3-pulse pattern. Radio operators learned to rig transmitters. During uncertain weather missions, Kovacs and 2 operators he'd trained stood ready to activate the beacon. The first test came November 29. Another Bremen mission, another fog bank. This time, Kovacs activated his beacon immediately. 18 bombers used it to find home. 0 were lost to navigation issues. The technique spread. Other bomber groups heard about it through pilot networks. Radio operators at RAF Molesworth and Thorpe Abbotts began experimenting. By mid-December, at least 6 groups were using variations, all without authorization. Walsh submitted documentation December 3. The response came December 18, further evaluation required. Timeline, 6 to 8 weeks. By then, the procedure had been used operationally 23 times across multiple groups, guiding an estimated 140 aircraft to safe landings. Colonel Reed called another meeting December 20. "Headquarters is taking too long," Reed said. "The technique works, we've proven it, but they want more testing. Meanwhile, we're using it because the alternative is losing crews." "So what do we do?" Sutherland asked. "We keep using it, document every instance, build an overwhelming case." Reed looked at Kovacs. "You're being reassigned temporarily. Travel to other bomber groups, train their operators, standardize the procedure. Make this so widespread that prohibition becomes impossible." Over 6 weeks, Kovacs visited 8 bomber groups. He taught operators how to pulse transmitters. He briefed pilots. He documented variations. What emerged was standardized procedure existing entirely outside official channels. 3-pulse pattern on 121.5 MHz, repeated at 5-second intervals. Pilots called it the static beacon. Radio operators called it the Kovacs signal. Headquarters called it unauthorized. But by February 1944, the technique was so embedded that prohibition would have required ordering groups to stop using a navigation aid that had saved hundreds of lives. No commander would issue that order. On February 28, 8th Air Force Headquarters quietly authorized experimental use of amplitude-pulsed carrier wave navigation assistance during adverse weather. The authorization included specifications nearly identical to Kovacs's documented procedure. The memo credited development to collaborative efforts between signals branch and field operators. Kovacs's name appeared once, in a footnote, as S/SGTD Kovacs, 381st BG, Primary Field Test Operator. The innovation had been authorized. The innovator had been footnoted. And in the bureaucratic transformation from field improvisation to official doctrine, the story of how a desperate radio operator had saved 12 bombers by creating patterns in static had been simplified into technical specifications that mentioned neither desperation nor improvisation. By spring 1944, the static beacon had become routine. Every bomber group used it. Training manuals included descriptions. New pilots were briefed on what to listen for. The technique that had started as unauthorized improvisation was now standard practice, implemented so completely that pilots arriving in theater assumed it had always existed. But standardization came with complications. Different groups had developed different pulse patterns. Some used 3 pulses like Kovacs's original. Others used 4 or 5. Some pulsed on emergency frequency. Others used navigation frequencies. The lack of coordination during unauthorized development had created a patchwork that worked individually but created confusion when bombers from different groups tried to use each other's beacons. In March 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters issued Technical Order 4423R, Standardized Amplitude Pulse Navigation Beacon Procedures. The order mandated a single pulse pattern, 3 pulses of 2.5 seconds, separated by 1.5-second pauses, with 5-second intervals between sets, and required all groups to implement it uniformly. The order made no mention of how the procedure had been developed. It read as though amplitude pulse beacons had been designed by signals engineers through systematic research, rather than improvised by a sergeant trying to save crews running out of fuel. Staff Sergeant Kovacs read the technical order and felt satisfaction mixed with erasure. His improvisation had become doctrine, but the doctrine described the technique as if it had emerged from institutional planning rather than individual desperation. He returned to routine radio operations at Ridgewell, monitoring communications, logging transmissions, occasionally activating the beacon during missions with deteriorating weather. The procedure worked flawlessly now that it was standardized. Hundreds of bombers had used it. Loss rates during bad weather operations had dropped measurably. But Kovacs's role had become invisible. New operators arriving at bases learned the beacon procedure from training manuals that credited Signals Branch Development without names. Pilots knew the beacon existed, but not who had invented it. The system had absorbed the innovation so completely that its origin story had been erased in favor of institutional narrative. In June 1944, Kovacs received orders for reassignment to the Pacific Theater. He packed his gear, said goodbye to operators he'd trained, and left England having changed how bomber navigation worked across the 8th Air Force without receiving any formal recognition beyond a footnote in a technical memo. Before he left, Major Sutherland found him in the radio room. "You know what you did changed things permanently," Sutherland said. "The beacon will outlive all of us. Pilots decades from now will use variations of what you invented, and they'll never know your name." "That's how it works, sir. The system absorbs innovations and forgets where they came from." "Doesn't that bother you?" Kovacs thought about it. 12 bombers came home the first night, hundreds more since then. The technique works, that's what matters. "But you should get credit." "Credit doesn't bring bombers home, sir. The beacon does." Sutherland nodded slowly. "Fair point, but for what it's worth, I'll remember, and I'll make sure the story doesn't completely disappear." Kovacs smiled. "I appreciate that, sir." He left England 3 days later. The static beacon continued operating at RAF Ridgewell and dozens of other bases across the European theater, guiding bombers through fog and darkness, using a technique that had started as desperate improvisation and become invisible standard procedure. The innovation endured. The innovator departed. And somewhere in the institutional machinery of military aviation, the connection between the two had already begun to fade. The war ended in August 1945. Kovacs returned to the United States in September, was discharged in October, and moved back to his hometown of Pittsburgh. He took a job as a radio technician for Westinghouse, married in 1947, and lived a quiet civilian life that bore no resemblance to the 6 months he'd spent improvising navigation aids for bombers lost in darkness. He didn't talk much about his wartime service. When people asked what he'd done, he said he'd operated radios. When they pressed for stories, he'd mention routine communications work and change the subject. The static beacon wasn't something that came up in casual conversation. In 1953, the Air Force published an official history of 8th Air Force bomber operations titled The Strategic Air Campaign in Europe, 1940-1945. Chapter 11 covered navigation systems and included a section on amplitude pulse beacons. The text read, "Improved radio navigation procedures, developed in 1944 through collaboration between Signals Branch engineers and field operations personnel, significantly reduced aircraft losses during adverse weather operations. Amplitude pulse beacon systems became standard equipment and contributed to improved mission success rates during the final year of the war." Kovacs wasn't mentioned. The technique was presented as institutional achievement, something that emerged from systematic engineering rather than improvised desperation. His name appeared exactly once in official Air Force records, a footnote in Technical Order 4423R identifying him as Primary Field Test Operator. That was the extent of his historical footprint. By the 1960s, amplitude pulse navigation beacons had been replaced by more sophisticated systems. VOR, TACAN, and eventually GPS made the wartime static beacon obsolete. The technique that had saved hundreds of lives became a historical curiosity, mentioned briefly in technical histories but otherwise forgotten. Kovacs died in 1979 at age 62 from lung cancer, likely caused by years of smoking. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his wartime service and his post-war career as a radio technician. It made no mention of the navigation beacon, the 12 bombers saved on that November night in 1943, or the hundreds of crews who had followed patterns of static through fog and darkness. His family cleaned out his house over following weeks, in a filing cabinet in the basement. They found a folder containing 3 items: a copy of Technical Order 4423R with the footnote mentioning his name highlighted in yellow, a handwritten log from November 17, 1943, documenting the first use of the beacon, and a letter from Major Sutherland dated June 1944. The letter read, "Danny, they'll forget you, but they won't forget what you did. The beacon will last longer than any of us. That has to be enough. Bill." His daughter, Sarah, read the documents without fully understanding their significance. She donated them to the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1982, where they were cataloged, archived, and effectively buried in boxes that almost no one would ever search through. The static beacon had saved lives, the innovator had been forgotten, and the distance between those two facts had become permanent. In 1998, a graduate student named Michael Chen was researching World War II navigation systems for his dissertation at MIT. He was specifically interested in field modifications, improvised solutions that hadn't emerged from systematic engineering but from combat necessity. While searching through digitized Air Force archives, he found Technical Order 4423R and noticed the footnote mentioning S/SGTD COVAX. The phrasing caught his attention. Primary field test operator suggested hands-on development rather than institutional research. Chen requested COVAX's service record. What he found was minimal: personnel file, assignment history, discharge paperwork. But cross-referencing dates, he discovered that COVAX had been at RAF Ridgewell in November 1943 when the first documented use of amplitude pulse beacons occurred. Following that thread, Chen found the archived documents that COVAX's daughter had donated in 1982. The handwritten log from November 1718, the letter from Sutherland, and the highlighted technical order. The log was revelatory. In COVAX's handwriting, it documented everything: the atmospheric interference, the failed standard procedures, the improvised pulse pattern, the 12 bombers guided home. It was a first-person account of innovation under pressure, written by someone who hadn't known his improvisation would become standard procedure. Chen tracked down Sarah Kovacs, now 64 and living in Philadelphia. He interviewed her about her father, learned about his post-war life, discovered that Danny Kovacs had never mentioned the beacon to his family. "He never talked about the war much," Sarah said. "I knew he'd been a radio operator, but I didn't know he'd invented anything important until I found those papers after he died." Chen spent 18 months researching the beacon's development and impact. He found combat reports documenting hundreds of uses. He calculated that the technique had directly contributed to saving an estimated 340 aircraft and 3,400 crew members between November 1943 and May 1945. His dissertation, titled Innovation from Necessity: Field-Developed Navigation Systems in WWII Bomber Operations, included a chapter on the static beacon that restored Kovacs's name to the story for the first time since 1944. The dissertation was published as a book in 2001 by Cambridge University Press. It sold approximately 2,800 copies, mostly to academic libraries and military historians. It was reviewed in 3 scholarly journals and mentioned in 1 aviation magazine. It did not become a bestseller. It did not revise mainstream historical narratives. But it preserved a story that had nearly been lost entirely. Sarah Kovacs read the chapter about her father and cried. She'd known he'd served honorably, but she hadn't known he'd changed how bombers navigated through darkness, that his improvisation had saved thousands of lives, or that history had forgotten him until one graduate student had decided to investigate a footnote. In 2005, the Air Force Association invited Sarah to a ceremony honoring World War II support personnel. She accepted, hoping her father's contribution might finally receive recognition. At the ceremony, a display panel about radio navigation included one sentence about amplitude pulse beacons. Improved navigation techniques, developed during 1944, enhanced bomber operations during adverse weather. No mention of COVAX, no mention of improvisation, just institutional passive voice crediting no one specifically. Sarah approached the curator afterward. "My father invented that beacon system. I have documentation." The curator was polite but firm. "We focus on major innovations with clear documentation trails. Individual contributions are difficult to verify and include without extensive corroboration." Sarah left the ceremony understanding something fundamental. Institutions remembered achievements but forgot achievers. Her father's innovation had become so integrated into standard practice that its origin had been erased by the same system that had adopted it. By 2015, modern aircraft navigation had evolved far beyond World War II radio beacons. GPS provided precision positioning. Instrument landing systems guided aircraft through any weather. The concept of following patterns of static through fog seemed quaintly archaic. But the principle persisted. Modern navigation still used pattern recognition. GPS satellites transmitted timed pulses that receivers decoded into position data. ILS systems used radio beams that pilots followed to runways. The technology had changed, but the underlying concept, using structured patterns to guide aircraft through conditions where visual navigation failed, remained foundational. Dr. Patricia Nguyen, an aerospace engineer teaching at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, was preparing a lecture on navigation system evolution when she encountered Michael Chen's 2001 book. The chapter on the static beacon caught her attention because it illustrated a principle she was trying to teach: that major innovations often emerged from field necessity rather than laboratory research. She incorporated COVAX's story into her curriculum. For the first time since the war ended, aviation students learned about the radio operator who had improvised a beacon using static patterns, saved hundreds of crews, and been forgotten by history. One of those students was Marcus Kovacs, Danny's great-grandson, who had enrolled at Embry-Riddle in 2014 without knowing his great-grandfather's wartime contribution. When Dr. Nguyen told the story in class, mentioning S/SGTD Kovacs by name, Marcus froze. After class, he approached her. "That was my great-grandfather." Dr. Nguyen stared at him. "You're related to Danny Kovacs." "Yes, ma'am. I never knew he'd invented anything. My grandmother, his daughter, might have mentioned he was in the war, but nothing specific." "Your great-grandfather changed how bomber navigation worked. He saved thousands of lives through improvisation that became standard procedure." Marcus contacted his grandmother Sarah, now 81. She sent him the documents Chen had referenced in his book, plus photographs of Danny in uniform, and the letter from Major Sutherland. Marcus wrote a paper for Dr. Nguyen's class titled "The Innovator History Forgot: How S/SGT Daniel Kovacs Changed Bomber Navigation." The paper documented his great-grandfather's contribution, included the primary source documents, and argued that field innovation deserved recognition equal to laboratory development. Dr. Nguyen submitted the paper to the Journal of Aviation History. It was published in March 2016 with extensive footnotes and archival photographs. The article reached approximately 5,000 readers, mostly academics and aviation historians. It generated modest discussion in specialized forums. It did not change mainstream understanding of World War II history. But it did reach one important reader, the curator of the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. In 2018, The museum opened a new exhibit on World War II navigation systems. One display panel, positioned beside a restored B-17 radio compartment, told Danny Kovacs's story completely for the first time in a major public venue. The panel included his photograph, excerpts from his November 1943 log, the letter from Sutherland, and statistics showing the beacon's impact. 340 aircraft saved, 3,400 crew members brought home, technique used operationally for 18 months before being replaced by more advanced systems. The exhibit concluded with a quote from Kovacs, taken from a letter he'd written to Sutherland in 1955. The beacon worked because it didn't fight the noise, it used the noise. Sometimes the best solutions come from accepting chaos and finding patterns within it. Marcus Kovacs attended the exhibit opening with Sarah, now 84 and using a wheelchair. They stood together in front of the display panel, reading about Danny's improvisation and its impact. "He never told us," Sarah said quietly. 70 years, and he never once mentioned that he'd saved thousands of lives. "Maybe he didn't think it mattered," Marcus replied. "Maybe he thought doing the work was enough, whether anyone remembered or not. But it does matter. He should have been recognized." "He is now, 75 years late, but he's being recognized." Sarah nodded slowly, tears running down her face, looking at her father's photograph preserved beside the radio equipment he'd improvised with, thinking about the distance between what someone did and what history remembered, and how sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, that distance could be closed by people who refused to let important stories disappear. In 2023, 80 years after Danny Kovacs first pulsed a carrier wave through atmospheric static above England, the National Air and Space Museum hosted a symposium on World War II technological innovation. One panel focused specifically on field modifications, solutions developed by enlisted personnel rather than engineers, implemented through necessity rather than authorization. Dr. Nguyen was invited to present Kovacs's story. She spoke for 20 minutes to an audience of approximately 200 people, historians, veterans, aerospace professionals, and students. She explained the technical problem, the improvised solution, the institutional resistance, and the eventual absorption that erased the innovator's name. She concluded with a question. How many other Daniel Kovacs exist in military history? How many innovations do we attribute to institutions when they actually came from individuals? How many people changed how we fight wars, build systems, or solve problems, but disappeared from the record because their contributions were absorbed so completely that we forgot they once seemed impossible? The symposium attendees discussed the question at length. Several historians mentioned similar cases: mechanics who modified equipment, medics who improvised procedures, logistics personnel who redesigned supply systems, all of whom had been forgotten while their innovations became standard. One attendee was a retired Air Force colonel named Robert Chen, son of Lieutenant James Chen, who had been co-pilot on Hell's Kitchen, the night the static beacon first guided bombers home. He approached Dr. Nguyen after the panel. "My father flew home that night following Kovacs's beacon," Chen said. "He talked about it occasionally, said he'd heard a rhythm in the static and followed it without understanding what it was. He always wondered who had been transmitting that pattern." "Your father survived because of what Kovacs did." "I know, and my father lived until 1997, raised 5 children, built a career as an airline pilot. All of that happened because a radio operator improvised a solution when standard procedures failed." Chen paused. "That's the real legacy, isn't it? Not recognition or fame, but the lives that continued because someone refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable." That conversation captured something essential about innovation and memory. The static beacon had worked. It had saved hundreds of crews. It had become standard procedure and influenced navigation system development for decades. and the man who had invented it had lived and died without public recognition. But the innovation endured. Every time an aircraft followed a navigation signal through bad weather, the principal Kovacs had discovered that structured patterns could guide through chaos, persisted in practice if not in memory. Marcus Kovacs, now an aerospace engineer working for Lockheed Martin, continued researching his great-grandfather's contribution. In 2024, he published an article in Aviation Week and Space Technology titled From Static to GPS: How WWII Field Innovation Shaped Modern Navigation. The article traced a direct line from Kovacs's improvised pulse beacon to contemporary positioning systems that all relied on the same principle: following structured signals through interference-heavy environments. The article reached 45,000 readers. It was cited in 3 academic papers. It was mentioned in one documentary about World War II technology. It did not make Danny Kovacs famous, but it ensured his story would be preserved in specialized historical records. That was enough, because the real measure of innovation wasn't recognition, it was persistence. The technique had outlived its creator by 8 decades and would continue influencing navigation systems for decades more. Danny Kovacs had pulsed a transmitter through atmospheric static on November 17, 1943, not for recognition, but because 12 bombers were running out of fuel and he couldn't accept letting them die when improvisation might save them. He'd succeeded. The bombers came home, the technique spread, the innovation endured. And 80 years later, his name was finally connected to the contribution he'd made, restored from footnotes and archived documents by people who understood that progress wasn't built by institutions alone, but by individuals willing to improvise when systems failed. The pattern endured. The memory had been recovered. And in the strange mathematics of historical recognition, perhaps that was the best outcome innovation could achieve. Not immediate fame, but eventual acknowledgement that someone had looked at chaos, found a pattern within it, and refused to accept that the impossible couldn't be done. The static beacon let bombers find home through darkness. And the story of that beacon, suppressed, forgotten, then finally remembered, proved that innovations might disappear from institutional memory, but could be recovered by those patient enough to search through archives and stubborn enough to insist that individual contributions mattered as much as collective achievements. Danny Kovacs had changed how bombers navigated. 80 years later, history finally said his name. The system had absorbed the innovation, but this time, the system didn't completely erase the innovator. Progress slow, imperfect, but real.